Jump forward with us 125 years from the Council of Nicaea to the last days of the Western Roman Empire. Gaul, Hispania, much of North Africa have all been lost. Aryan barbarians control nearly all of the Western Roman world. Britannia had long ago been abandoned. The Huns have smashed into the empire, sapping its remaining strength. But there was still the East, with its rich provinces of Anatolia and Egypt to support the empire. If the East would just step in, perhaps Rome could be put back together as it had under the reign of Aurelian. But the East was in the middle of a religious dispute. Now, that wasn't the only reason this didn't happen, of course. At this point, the East and the West had in some ways become closer to rivals than to coordinated parts of the empire, and the Huns, although not causing as much damage as in the West, had extracted unimaginable tribute from the Eastern Empire. But for all that, it certainly didn't make it any more likely that the East would step in when, in the middle of this crisis, the Emperor Theodosius II found himself mired in a religious schism. And here's where it gets really complex. All that esoteric and minor doctrinal stuff we talked about in the previous episodes, that's just a warm-up for what's coming now, so get ready. So there's this monk, Nestorius, and he's chummy with the emperor. He gets tapped to be the Patriarch of Constantinople, just about the biggest deal you can be in the Christian world at the time, with Rome itself still barely part of the empire. But he gets caught up in a local debate over the nature of Christ, and starts espousing that Christ has two separate natures, one divine and one human. We'll call this Nestorianism. This, of course, causes a huge flameout with the folks that we'll call, for reasons that will become obvious in a moment, the Chalcedonians, as they believed that Christ had two perfectly unified natures, one divine and one human, which of course caused a huge blow-up with the guys that we'll call the Monophysites, who believed that Christ was entirely of one nature, divine and human. I know what you're thinking. If anything, this all makes too much sense. But just in case a few of you got lost in how much sense that just made, I'll dive into a little more detail. That really is the basic split, though. Does Christ have two separate natures, two unified natures, or one nature that sort of encompassed what everybody else called two natures? And that may seem really trivial, but to people of the day, it was more than a simple matter of life and death. It was a matter of eternal life or eternal damnation. So this is really, really important to a lot of people, but it also gets wrapped up with church politics, regional disputes, and imperial authority. Because this guy, Cyril of Alexandria, starts calling Nestorius' teachings heretical. But the clergy in Constantinople are all basically like, hey, who are you from faraway Alexandria to be telling us what to do? So Cyril actually reaches out to the Pope in Rome and asks him for a judgment, who in turn basically says, Cyril, go excommunicate this guy if he doesn't change his mind in like 10 days. So Nestorius turns to his buddy, Theodosius II, and says, let's call a council and figure this out. And by figure this out, I mean let's excommunicate Cyril. But before the council even gets called, Cyril stands up and is basically like, you can't excommunicate me, I excommunicate you! And now it's on. The council is called, and Cyril tries to ninja his way into being the guy running the council, basically by saying, I'm the guy running this council. At first, this doesn't work, but several of the delegations are delayed, and this gives Cyril time to prod some of the undecided bishops until he has a majority. And so he just declares the council started, and himself in charge. Nestorius is, of course, having none of this, doesn't acknowledge Cyril, and refuses to accept that the council can begin before the delegation from Antioch arrives, which it hasn't yet. The bishops who back Nestorius all show up to the place where the council's being held to protest, and things start to get rowdy. At this point, the emperor's representative steps in and asks Cyril to just wait for 4 more days to see if the Antiochians arrive, which is when Cyril really steps up his ninja game and basically tricks the emperor's representative into reading the emperor's decree, which ends with an offhand line about how he wants them to, quote, start the council without delay and bring unity back to the church quickly. But an offhand line by the emperor is still an order by the emperor, and so with that imperial decree read aloud to what was effectively a quorum, because the protesting bishops who supported Nestorius were there in the hall, legally for both the church and the state, the council had now started. And of course that council promptly held up the excommunication of Nestorius. But then the delegation from Antioch finally arrives, and miffed that Cyril had started the thing without them, forms their own council and excommunicates Cyril. So Cyril's council excommunicates the Antiochians, and now that everybody's excommunicated everybody else, everybody has to get word to the emperor, who's back in Constantinople, about who has been excommunicated. But the Nestorians have more friends at court, and they divert all of Cyril's messages, until Cyril's faction sends a man dressed as a beggar with a message hidden in a hollowed-out cane to secret his message through. So the emperor gets the news and banishes Nestorius, which clearly that resolves everything. Everyone would meekly give up, agree to get along, and all splits in the church would be healed forever. And yet, shockingly, everybody just kept excommunicating each other. The emperor called a second council to determine which of these excommunications were really legal, but this council was a mess too. Famously known as the Robbers' Council, as it was convened with no time for any of the representatives from the West to get there, and so it was run almost entirely by Monophysites from the East. They proceed to excommunicate and condemn everybody even remotely connected with Nestorius. And then they went even further and basically declared that the only correct way to see Christ was as having one nature. And of course, this sets off everybody. The Pope was livid. The bishops that were excluded were furious. And it goes without saying that those who got excommunicated or condemned without having any say in the matter were a little put out as well. So the church starts to tear itself apart over this. And in the midst of all of it, Theodosius II croaks. So the new emperor, Marcian, calls a third council to try to unravel this and figure out if any of it was legal at all. So this time, the bishops all come together at a place called Chalcedon. All of the things the Second Council had said were basically immediately overturned. A bunch of the folks who had supported the Second Council were demoted or excommunicated, and the Chalcedonian Creed, or the idea that Christ was two perfectly combined natures, was adapted as official canon of the church. Okay, so surely now everything would be settled, right? Wrong again! See, this is right about where the Coptic, Ethiopian, Eritrean, Syriac, and Armenian Apostolic and Malankara churches split from what would now be called the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, although at the time they were really one thing. Remember in the Justinian and Theodora episodes how Justinian kept trying to bring the church back together? This is the split he would later be trying to heal. And remember how Justinian was Orthodox and Theodora was Monophysite? Again, that's a big deal because this council, the Council of Chalcedon, split the whole Christian world down those lines. And this division would rip the Byzantine world apart for centuries. It would take on political dimensions as well as religious ones, as one easy way to oppose the emperor was always to stir up whatever religious faction he wasn't a part of. This split would also make it easier for other groups to break the more Monophysite-leaning regions off from the empire as it started to decline. Who knows how history would have turned out without these schisms, heresies, and disputes? Would it have saved Rome, or would it have just left Europe even more fragmented without those hard-fought ideas to bind it together? What we do know is that all this thought and all this effort helped to shape the late classical and early medieval period. For better or worse, these esoteric disputes played a huge part in the transition from the ancient world to the medieval one. So thank you for bearing with us as we wound our way through all that esoterica. These names, Arianism, Monophysites, Chalcedonians, they're gonna come up again and again as we discuss this period of history, and there's no way we could give a complete picture of this era without them. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. In 1792, Britain has just come out of a war that's cost it not only much of its national treasury, but also one of its most lucrative overseas colonies, North America. The empire needs new sources of revenue, new opportunities for trade, and there's one clear possibility: China. By the end of the 18th century, the world had become a much smaller place, with European traders traveling the globe to feed the hungry markets of the industrializing West. Wars were fought all over the planet to secure exotic goods or the raw materials needed to power new economies of the rising European empires. But China still remained aloof. Demand for Chinese goods was high. Silk, porcelain, and especially tea were coveted by buyers back in Europe. But the Chinese emperors saw all these foreign traders as a potentially destabilizing influence, and as they had done throughout Chinese history, placed strict controls on foreign trade. Specifically, they limited trade to just a few ports. Traders weren't allowed to set foot in the empire except at a handful of cities designated for that purpose. And all trade had to go through a trade monopoly known as the Hong, who could tax and regulate foreign trade as they saw fit. By the middle of the 18th century, this was taken further, and all foreign trade was restricted to a single port, Canton. This drove resentment among the European traders who saw limitless opportunity for profit if they could just get their hands on it. And those Europeans trading in China were, in some ways, a self-selecting group. If you're gonna make your living transporting goods thousands of miles from your home, you probably believe in the inherent value of unrestricted trade, which meant that these rules did not sit well with the Europeans, and piracy and smuggling began to rise. Even within the official channels of trade, merchants began to strain at these limitations. Eventually, an employee of the Honorable East India Company, the militarized trade organization responsible for British affairs in India, pushed by what he saw as abuses of corrupt officials and undue restrictions on free trade, decided that it was time to openly break the rules that the Chinese imposed. He left Canton and took his grievances upriver, literally and figuratively, wanting to be heard by someone in the Chinese hierarchy who was outside the Hong, outside the monopoly set up in Canton. And here's where divides of culture come in. Because it's possible that he wasn't acting in a way that he saw as malicious or even inappropriate. In fact, he may have been acting in a way that he thought of as perfectly reasonable were he in England. But he wasn't in England, and the arrogance of this traitor just deciding that his complaints should be elevated to imperial court rather than going through the proper authorities was unbelievable to the Chinese. More than that, it put into question whether these Europeans would stay in one port at all, or even obey Chinese law. And so further restrictions were put into place. Trade was clamped down on even more. But European demands for Chinese goods, especially English demands for their newfound love of black tea, continued to grow, which brings us back to 1792. By this point, the British were importing tens of millions of pounds of tea every year. Within 2 decades, import duties on tea would account for 10% of the government's entire revenue. Tea was one of the major drivers of the economy. Tea was so essential to the British world that the Canton system was simply no longer acceptable. And more than that, the British were now running an enormous trade deficit with the Chinese. Millions of pounds of silver were flowing out of the British Empire and into China. On top of that, recent European struggles had cut them off from the silver mines of South America, and costly foreign wars had left the treasury dry. Even the Honorable East India Company was broke, incurring a huge debt to finance their military conquests of parts of India. The British Empire, for all of its power and its wealth, for all its global might and territory in every region of the globe, simply did not have the raw currency it needed to continue paying for its tea habit. So, the British decided that it was time to finally send an official diplomatic mission to China. No more traders, merchants, or pirates. This was going to be a real envoy from one monarch to another to talk about opening up trade. After some consideration, it was decided that the first Earl of Macartney, a seasoned colonial governor, should lead the mission. His aims were simple: end the Canton system, establish a permanent embassy, or at least get a permanent British representative in the imperial court, and, if possible, secure the grant of a small island off the coast of China where British merchants could operate under British rather than Chinese law. So they packed the hold of a ship with clocks and telescopes and even carriages to be presented to the Chinese emperor and began their trip. They sailed east around the Cape of Good Hope, with only one minor detour when the trade winds pushed them all the way to Rio de Janeiro. At last, though, they arrived in China. They immediately asked to dock at a port much closer to Beijing than Canton. This was considered bad form by the Chinese, but representatives of the East India Company explained that they had expensive gifts for the emperor on board, and didn't want any of them to get ruined in a long overland journey, so the Chinese acquiesced. They and their goods were ferried up the Grand Canal to Beijing, and here they assembled their gifts and prepared for the last leg of their journey, over the Great Wall and to the Emperor's summer palace at Jahal. Here they finally met the Emperor. And trouble began immediately. Because in the presence of the Emperor, it was expected that everyone kowtow, or kneel and bow so low that their head touched the floor. And Macartney, being a seasoned British governor and gentleman, hailing from what he believed was the most powerful and civilized nation in the world with, as he saw it, the most divine monarch, and not only the right but the duty to spread the British way around the globe, refused to do so. After all, if he wasn't going to touch his head to the floor for King George, he certainly wasn't going to do it here. So, after some wrangling and protestations, he proposed a counter-solution. He would perform the kowtow so long as, every time it was done, a Chinese official of equal rank would kowtow to a picture of George III. This was, of course, ludicrous to the Chinese, as, after all, they were from the most powerful and civilized nation in the world, with the most divine monarch, and who was this barbarian to try to put his king on anything like the emperor's level? Seriously. But even without the kowtow issue truly resolved, with Macartney merely genuflecting in the end, as he would to King George, the meeting went forward. Macartney showed off the marvels of British science, although mostly the flashier and less practical kind, and presented them to the emperor. And here too, signals got crossed, because the Chinese court took this as a tribute mission. After all gift-giving missions to the Emperor are tribute missions. What else would it be? And yet the British thought that they were demonstrating all the reasons that China would benefit from opening up trade with them. So in the end, Macartney was dismissed without the Emperor agreeing to a single one of the goals he set out to achieve. And the Emperor sent one of the most gloriously, imperially snarky letters ever penned to King George, thanking him for his tribute which, though neither he nor the Chinese actually wanted it, he would graciously accept out of respect for how far George had sent people just to pay him tribute. But no, China didn't need baubles or knickknacks from England, thank you. Trade would remain the way it was. So Britain was left with a massive trade deficit. The East India Company was £28 million in debt as a result of their war in India, and the royal coffers were nearly dry. They needed to find some product the Chinese wanted. And then they did. Opium. Last we left off, the treasury of the British Empire was flowing into China, and the Honorable East India Company was still reeling under the staggering debt it owed the government for underwriting its military conquests in India. Something needed to be done. They needed to find some tradable good, something other than silver, that the Chinese wanted to import to offset the massive costs of the Victorian need for tea. And the answer they found was opium. By the early 1800s, tea sales in England were unimaginably high. Given the quantity they were importing, the average English household spent about 5% of its income just on tea. The government itself was basically propped up by the tea trade. Because the government had lent the Honorable East India Company so much money to conquer parts of India, and because a huge portion of the East India Company's revenue came from transporting tea from China, the country was even more dependent on the tea trade, as that revenue was being used not only to repay the debt the company had incurred, but to pay interest on it. But even as the tea craze was consuming England, the Honorable East India Company was also coming to the realization that their conquests in India weren't realizing the returns they'd hoped. Their plans to grow cotton in India had gone awry as cotton production in the Americas, and especially in Egypt, were on the rise. But it turns out that something else grew really well on all that land that they'd planned to use for cotton. Poppies. So the East India Company found its solution. They would grow poppies in India, convert them into opium, sell that at a profit in China, use the profit to buy tea, and then sell that at a profit back in Britain. There were only a few problems with this plan. Besides the fact that it meant pushing drugs on an unheard-of scale, there was also the issue that opium was technically illegal in China. And the Honorable East India Company, being of course the Honorable East India Company, would never do something illegal. Okay, they would, but they didn't want to risk getting kicked out of China or cut off from its tea. So they set up a market in Calcutta, basically the part of India closest to China that they controlled. And they said, anybody who wants to buy opium, we're selling it right here. No idea what you might want to do with it, but hey, that's not our business. Who wants some opium? Come on. And then they would let the smugglers handle it from there. So now you've got a bunch of dodgy characters selling drugs in the Middle Kingdom, basically backed by the largest corporation and the largest national economy in the world. And as Indian opium turned out to be even stronger than the domestically grown stuff, everybody wanted it. So opium sales skyrocketed, and by 1835 they were moving roughly 3,064,000 pounds of opium per year into China. And that number was only going to get bigger, because in 1833 the British government decided to finally do away with the Honorable East India Company's monopoly on the opium trade. Now everybody wanted a piece of the action, and opium started flowing into China completely unregulated, increasing supply, driving prices down, and making the substance even more accessible. By 1839, nearly 5,639,000 pounds of opium would be pouring into China every year. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because it's not like the Chinese were just sitting around letting this happen. As piles of money which the government desperately needed flowed out of the country, the emperor appointed an official named Lin Zexu to address the disastrous effects of opium on the country. He was brilliant, incorruptible, and utterly inflexible. He saw the threat of the West and the morally corrupting effect that opium had had on the Chinese people, and decided that the only approach to take was the complete removal of opium from China. By March of 1839, he had reached Canton. It was the source of all this opium, so he planned to cut it off at its source. His actions were swift and uncompromising. He arrested thousands of Chinese opium traders, forced addicts into rehabilitation programs, confiscated opium pipes, and closed opium dens. And then he took on the Western traders. At first, he wrote an open letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to her conscience, a letter which it's very likely she never received. When he got no reply, he demanded that the foreigners surrender their stores of opium. The foreign merchants stalled and prevaricated, giving up small amounts of their opium stock, but nowhere near what Lin Zexu had demanded. So he marshaled the troops and put the foreign warehouses to siege. The merchants holed up for a month and a half, but in the end they gave in, and were forced to surrender 21,000 chests of opium. For the next 23 days, Zexu burned the opium with lye. This was a king's ransom in opium. The amount of money this destruction represented is staggering. It was roughly 1/6 as much as the British Empire, the largest, most far-flung empire in the world, had spent on its military the previous year. Needless to say, everybody involved was going bankrupt. Now, there is some debate over whether the Chinese offered tea in exchange for the surrendered opium, but what is certain is that the merchants never received any tea, and instead the local chief superintendent of British trade, one Captain Charles Elliot, promised the merchants that the British government would cover their losses if they would leave peacefully. Which, of course, the British government absolutely refused to do. The outcry over this illegal seizure of British goods began to grow. Meanwhile, back in China, a reprehensible incident occurred where some drunken British sailors beat a man to death. Lin Zexu demanded the execution of a British sailor in recompense. Captain Elliot, who actually disliked the opium trade and was somewhat sympathetic to the Chinese situation, put out a reward for evidence of who had committed the murder, and gave money to the victim's family. He then had the criminals tried on his ship, inviting Lin Zexu or a representative to witness the proceedings, although none took him up on the invitation. He sentenced the men to hard labor back in England. But this wouldn't work for Lin Zexu. After all, the whole point of his demand was to show that foreigners couldn't just violate Chinese law on Chinese soil. So in response, he stopped all food being supplied to the British and posted signs telling them that frothier water sources had been poisoned. Next, he ordered the Portuguese to eject all British from Macau. He was going to see these pesky British and their drugs off Chinese soil once and for all. So the British retreated to a barren nothing island off the coast. A barren nothing island that will eventually be known as Hong Kong. Their food crisis was at a head, though. Captain Elliot sent a request for food sales to resume. The response was delayed, so he sent men ashore to buy food. But as they were heading back, these provisions were seized by Chinese officials. Soon, a firefight broke out between the blockading Chinese junks and the British ships, and thus began the First Opium War. Guns had been fired, lives had been lost, but full-scale war wasn't a certainty yet. The British set up a blockade. The Chinese were offering to let British captains dock so long as they signed a bond saying that they would never sell opium in China and were willing to be subject to Chinese law. But the British had already put out the order. No British ship was to trade with the Chinese. Tensions are high. Something would have to give. On the 3rd of November, 1839, a British ship by the name of the Royal Saxon approached Canton. They were signaled to stop, to turn back, but they made a run for it. One of the British ships in the blockade fired a warning shot. It skipped past their bow. The cannon shot was heard from the shore. The Chinese admiral stationed at Canton made his decision. He would send out his fleet to protect the Royal Saxon. And so, a small host of junks and fireships began to pour out of the Canton harbor. The situation was confused. The commander of the ship that originally fired requested permission to engage. Captain Elliot, the superintendent of British trade and the man who'd convinced the British merchants to hand over their opium in the first place, initially wavered, but the Chinese ships were bearing down hard. Another request to engage was made. The Chinese ships were festooned with red flags, the color of war. The honor of his nation and his flag would not allow Elliot to back down before such intimidation. The order was given, and the men engaged. The first broadside roared over the water. British shells shredded one of the fire rafts. There was a cataclysmic explosion, a gout of flame and sea. One of the war junk's magazines had been hit. All that was left of it were burning planks carried by the waves. The ships turned to give another broadside, but the outmatched Chinese junks began to retreat. Only the proud admiral's flagship was left, standing defiantly, returning shot. But it was hopelessly outclassed and already damaged. Seeing the admiral standing alone, Elliot told his captains to cease fire. The point had been made, there was no need for meaningless slaughter. And so, seeing the ceasefire, the flagship turned and limped back to port. The first real battle of the Opium Wars had come and passed, with the British bombarding the Chinese forces for defending a British ship which they themselves had originally fired on. For some time after this, there was a lull. Some in China even thought that the British were too far away to seriously pursue a war. But the truth was, the British were simply mustering their forces. At that very moment, Marines and soldiers from India were being redeployed and transported to China. The latest ships were dispatched from British naval yards to serve in the fight. Many in the British Admiralty saw this as an excellent opportunity to field test the iron, steam, and sail ships that were just rolling off the lines. When the forces arrived, though, the British descended on the island of Chusan. The Chinese and British officials met, once on the Chinese flagship, once on the British ship. Each time, the British made their demands clear: surrender the island and no one will be harmed. And each time, the Chinese responded in baffled disbelief. The Chinese officials told the British that, hey, we never did you any harm. It's not right to punish us for the acts of those in Canton. They implored the British to turn away, but the British had their duty, and as the Chinese officials made clear on their way out, so did they. The next morning, the bombardment began. Soon the Chinese forces retreated behind the walls of their city, and the British Marines landed unopposed. They set up their guns and then took the night to rest. By the next day, they found the city nearly deserted. Chusan had been captured with little loss of life, and the British had a jumping-off point for their operations should they decide to threaten Shanghai. By this point, the emperor had dismissed Lin Zexu, the righteous minister who he had so celebrated a short while before, and replaced him with an official named Qishan, who was empowered to treat with the British. Qishan and Elliot began to discuss a settlement. They haggled over reparation for the destroyed opium, and eventually came to a figure of £6 million. But Elliot was still supposed to get territory for the British Empire that they could use for a port. He offered to return Chusan in exchange for some other island, but Qishan was not about to give away portions of sovereign China. And so the talks broke down. Then, as the new year passed, at least for the English, an opium runner, which had snuck its way into Canton, came back with the rumor that the emperor intended to resume the war and attack the British. Elliot decided to preempt such an assault, though the wisdom of trusting unsubstantiated rumors coming from opium runners is a bit questionable. Really, it's unlikely that such an attack was ever actually in the works. But working with the information he had, Elliot commanded the British forces to open fire on the Chinese fortifications at Chuenpi near Canton on the morning of January 7, 1841. The fighting lasted mere hours. The British guns ripped through the fortifications and silenced any counter-batteries with haste. Then, Indian and British Marines landed and rapidly pushed the Chinese ground forces back. Tragically, a rumor had been circulating among the Chinese that the British executed every prisoner they captured, and so many hopelessly fought on to the death, until their battalions were in tatters and their dead outnumbered their living. By 11 in the morning, the British flag flew over the Chinese battlements. 600 Chinese lay dead. A meager 100 were captured. Among the British, only 30 were wounded, and those not even from enemy fire, but because of their pieces of artillery overheating and exploding. Meanwhile, the Nemesis, the iron steam and sail ship that was being tested in Chinese waters, demonstrated the power of its guns and rockets, dispatching junks and chasing away the Chinese fleet. 3 further forts stood to be captured, but the next morning, a Chinese physician came under flag of truce to ask on behalf of Qishan. Despite the overwhelming desire of the troops to cut their way to Canton, Elliot acquiesced. Horrified by the slaughter he had just witnessed, he wrote to one of the British trades who was pushing the war that he hoped to resolve it without further bloodshed, and that if further conflict was necessary, it was clear that they could take what they wanted. So he agreed to meet. Soon, terms were hammered out. The Chinese would pay $6 million in reparations. The British would pay $6 million to buy the island of Hong Kong. Ambassadors would be exchanged. The Chinese agreed to not call the British tribute-bearing barbarians anymore, and the British would return all the forts and the territory that they had taken during the war. And most importantly, trade would resume in a much more free and open manner. So, problem solved. The Chinese get just about the best terms they could conceivably hope for under the circumstances, and the British get to fulfill their mission and open up a whole new empire for trade. There's been some bloodshed, but in the end, everybody's happy, right? Well, not exactly. Elliot's boss back in England, a fellow named Lord Palmerston, who will undoubtedly crop up in other episodes down the line, was not happy. The British Empire didn't get the massive sum of money he wanted as reparations for the opium that was destroyed. They didn't get to keep the territory that they'd conquered. They didn't get as many open ports as he would like, and perhaps most of all, he was livid that Elliot, who had never really been comfortable with the drug trade in the first place, didn't even ask that opium be legalized in China. So, Elliot, for his swift and nearly bloodless execution of the war, was dismissed and sent packing. And Qishan, the emperor had to be ecstatic with these terms, right? I mean, the Chinese were clearly outmatched, and at the end of the day, all they had to cede was a barren rock in the middle of the ocean. Pretty good deal, right? Well, the emperor was not so happy. In fact, he immediately recalled Qishan and ordered him executed for treason. Apparently, he thought they could have gotten a better deal. Don't worry, Qishan lived, he's fine, but needless to say, neither party ever signed this treaty. So join us next time as all the voices of reason are removed from the Opium War. With all the moderate voices out of the picture, there are only two ways this conflict can now go. The Chinese can drive the British from their shores and clamp back down on trade with the outside world, or the British can bring this great empire to its knees and force them to trade on their terms. There could be no other resolution. When the Chinese emperor dismissed Qishan, he summoned 3 men to replace him and take over the efforts against the British. One was his nephew, who would serve as the main commander. The other 2 were officials and military men. Before they left, one of the officials recommended that they accept peace and let the British busy themselves with trade while they modernized and strengthened the Chinese army. But the emperor would hear of no such thing. They would take back what had been lost. Chinese forces now massed around Canton. Elliot was still there. He had been trying, with almost no success, to limit the opium that flowed into the now British-controlled port. And the same official who had tried to reason with the emperor now reached out to him, hoping that the large numbers of fresh Chinese troops he brought in would give him more leverage at the bargaining table, and perhaps get Elliot to agree to an even better deal than he'd already offered. But this would not be the case. And so Elliot started concentrating British forces, telling the British and American merchants in Canton to withdraw. By the 22nd of May, 1841, the Chinese were shelling the British factories in town. In the night, they launched fireships across the river at the becalmed British forces. The great steamship Nemesis fired up its engines, powering out of harm's way. The fireships missed the rest of the fleet, sailing past and slamming into the port, setting the town on fire. A gun battle took place, but by dawn, the river was firmly in the hands of the British, and the fort guns the Chinese held were silenced. Now it was the British's turn to go on the offensive. But that offensive was halted by a Chinese plea for a truce. 2 days later, though, one of the Chinese commanders decided to break the truce. Desperation had set in. They launched manned fireships to try to destroy the British fleet, but even this would not avail them. In the end, the Chinese paid an indemnity to the British to not sack Canton, but riots by the peasants, looting by both the British and Chinese armies, and the complete lack of resolution on the matters of the opium, trade, and Hong Kong issues meant further conflict was inevitable. But as the British withdrew to regroup at Hong Kong, a typhoon hit. The cutter Elliot was on was smashed, leaving him swimming with the flotsam. He began swimming hard for Hong Kong when, over the horizon, he saw a sail. It wasn't a British sail. It was the battened sail of a Chinese war junk. He knew he had to swim for his life. Hong Kong was right in front of him. All he had to do was make it. Exhausted, he dragged himself onto the shore, only to be greeted by the news that, actually, he was fired. He'd been fired 4 months ago. It was 1841. Getting news halfway around the world still took a while. And the men who replaced Elliot were far less open to finding common ground with the Chinese. They were here to expand the rights of the British Empire by any means necessary. The war would no longer be interrupted by truces, ceasefires, and talks of peace. And thus the British began on their campaign north and east, capturing fortresses on their way. Each fortress wasn't just a victory in its own right, but a threat to the Emperor in Beijing. Each fallen citadel was another jumping-off point that the British now held, ever closer to the Chinese capital. And this time, there would be no returning land. There would be no giving back territory unless all British demands were met. These islands and fortresses the British captured would be held hostage, not to be relinquished as a sign of good faith or as a part of an agreement to reach a peace, but only in exchange for the ransom the government back in England demanded. As they took these fortresses, though, the British found a strange thing. Everywhere they went, next to the cannon, in the guard towers, they would find opium pipes. The Chinese resistance was weakened by the very drug they were supposed to be fighting against. From the officers all the way down to the enlisted men, much of the army was addicted to the drug. The British forces, on the other hand, were a mixture of discipline and severity. The new British commanders saw themselves as the civilized force in the conflict, and forbade looting on the pain of death, and even prevented their soldiers from cutting off captured prisoner queues for trophies. But when one of their soldiers was kidnapped and beaten during a resupply mission, they had no problem burning several of the nearby villages in retaliation, as if they could train the population through punishment. As the winter of 1841 to 1842 passed into spring and Chinese attacks became even more desperate, the retaliations simply became more brutal. But their advance pressed on. By the middle of June, Shanghai was taken, and then in July, Xinjiang, where we get a prelude of what's to come with the Manchu commander turning on the Chinese populace, illustrating the cultural and racial divides that would tear China apart over the next 60 years. After securing Xinjiang, the British finally moved on to Nanking. Both sides knew this would be the final showdown. The British wouldn't have to seize the capital at Beijing because Nanking stood at the entrance to the Yangtze, the river which was the heart of China. It was the superhighway down which all trade to the capital flowed. If Chinese access to the Yangtze could be cut off, the capital would starve, and much of the kingdom would be in chaos. So it all came down to this. It all came down to the capture of Nanking. But there would be no great showdown, no final battle, because the Emperor finally began to realize that he was beaten, and that if they lost Nanking, there would be no negotiation, only surrender. So better to negotiate while he still could. He sent an official down to talk to the British. At first, talks went nowhere, as the British demanded that the official be given authority to make binding deals for his government, the lack of which the court in Beijing had taken advantage of in prior negotiations to get out of treaties made by other officials. Cultural misunderstandings and attempts to delay as long as possible by the Chinese officials delayed the process slightly further, but by the middle of August, under imminent threat of attack on the city, negotiations commenced. In the end, though, despite technically holding Nanking, it was clear who had all the leverage, whose gunboats could impose their will if negotiations failed, and the Chinese ended up conceding on nearly every point. The 6 million that Elliot had asked for now became 21 million, and the amount was granted. A number of new ports for trade were opened up. The old Kohong monopoly was abolished, and tariff rates were to be agreed upon rather than set by the sovereign Chinese government. The island of Hong Kong was ceded in perpetuity to the British, and British subjects would operate there under British law, completely free from Chinese jurisdiction, and British consulates were established at the treaty ports. The only two things that the Chinese didn't concede on were Christian missionaries, which were such a touchy subject that not even the British delegation tried to bring them up, and opium. The Chinese government refused to legalize opium, even though the British representatives tried to lean on them to do so. Even though they had no power to prevent its sale, they steadfastly refused to legalize the drug. This would eventually lead directly to the Second Opium War, a conflict which plays out shockingly similarly to the first, at least in the broad strokes, but this time with most of the major colonial powers involved. These two wars, and the treaties which follow them, will go down in Chinese history as the unequal treaties, and begin what will later be labeled by the communist government as the Century of Humiliation. While at the time they may have seemed just a part of a larger destabilization and realignment of the country as a whole, they have since been seared into the Chinese consciousness, and to this day are conjured whenever dealings with the West take a turn for the worse. They are used as a milestone, a measuring marker for how far the country has come in the last 150 years, and as propaganda to remind everybody of that fact. And while these wars have perhaps the lowest casualty count of any of the conflicts that extra history has covered to date, they have had a profound impact on global politics and global understanding all the way to today. The Opium Wars are long over, but their effects linger in significant ways. See you next time. The Republic is at a precipice. Elections are happening like nobody's ever seen. Demagogues preach the politics of violence in the streets. Vast amounts of foreign labor instill fear in the native workforce, and the rich sit simply consuming all they can, blind to the poor masses that can only take so much before they break and overthrow them. All the while, the political elite is desperately trying to stop the very monster they created. But the political elite have gotten so stale, so tied to the interests of money, that they can't think to do anything but more of the same. The year is 121 BCE, and this is how republics fall. But 121 BCE is a long way off yet, because to tell the tale of 121 BCE, we have to talk about the things that led up to it. To start with, we have to speak of the growth of Rome, for you would be hard-pressed to find a century more filled with war and expansion experienced by a single people. The 2nd century BCE was when the Roman Empire was won. From the dawn of the 2nd century to the 130s, the Romans smashed the Carthaginian Empire, taking back all of modern Spain and getting a foothold in North Africa. They fought the Macedonians and the Seleucids to attain total control of Greece. They threw back the Gauls and the Ligurians, finally conquering all of northern Italy. They captured the eastern coast of the Adriatic. The Roman Republic more than doubled in size in a single generation. And all of this conquest was born on the backs of the veteran army, the citizen soldiers that fought the later Punic Wars. They conquered the globe for Rome, or at least what seemed like the globe to them. But what was their reward? What happened to them when they returned home? To answer that, we have to answer another question. What came from all these wars? What happened to the defeated peoples? Well, they were made slaves and sold back in Roman markets. So Rome was now flooded with slaves. As tribe after tribe, country after country fell before the victorious Roman armies, tens if not hundreds of thousands of people were sent back to Italy in chains. And this changed the economy of all of Rome. Where once the engine of production had been the small landholder, the family that farmed their own land, now wealth, unimaginable wealth, started to coalesce. Vast estates were gathered, worked solely by slaves. This new, cheap foreign labor completely displaced the blue-collar working citizens of Rome. And as this new, cheap labor flooded in, those that could afford to buy that labor needed even more land to put it to work on. And how did they get that land? Well, remember that the Roman army had a property requirement to enlist. You had to be able to buy your own gear. Armor, helmet, shield, pilum, and gladius, these were all paid for by the soldier who carried them. It was a mark of pride amongst Romans to be of the class that could afford to join the army. You might not be super rich, but you were doing well enough to do your duty for the state. And for a long time, this worked, because most of Rome's wars were fought in Italy, only going abroad for brief campaigns, or in the most dire of emergencies like that death struggle with Carthage. But that was no longer the case. We look to that map and we see a long campaign in Spain and Greece. These just weren't 6-month local affairs anymore. And those that served were often called up time and again for the nearly continuous wars that Rome found itself in. But you can't leave a farm unattended for years on end, and as these citizen soldiers marched across faraway plains, their farms lay fallow. And so, as they were out serving Rome, they went bankrupt. And even those who still had something to come home to found that they couldn't compete against the vast slave farms, and soon sold to the owners of the much larger estates, and were turned off their lands to be replaced by foreign slaves. And so the farms of the rich who stayed in Rome grew and grew with every war. Never before had Rome seen such a disparity in income. I mean, Rome had never been a place of equality, but outside the city, what might be called the middle class had all but vanished. Smaller landholders began to trickle and then flood into Rome, looking for work, looking for a place where they might earn a living for themselves and for their families now that the trade they had always practiced was disappearing. But many of them never found work, or worked odd jobs that didn't fill their days. And this gave them time. Time to sit and stew. Time to be angry. Time to be angry without even really being sure who they were angry at. Time to feel mistreated. And into this world, two boys are born. One named Tiberius, one named Gaius. They were born plebeians, but of the most notable heritage. Their father had been a consul, and their mother was the daughter of Scipio Africanus. Yes, that one. Tiberius was the elder by 10 years, more even in temperament, more measured in speech. It's him we'll follow first. Tiberius was born in the 160s. His father was a celebrated man, twice consul, twice given a triumph, hailed for his moral fiber. But his father was old when Tiberius was born, and died when the boy was somewhere between 10 and 15 years of age. Tiberius was raised in the Roman arts, rhetoric, philosophy, religion, and of course war. As soon as he was able, he became a military tribune, the first rank on the Roman political ladder, and he shipped off to serve with his half-brother, the famed Scipio Aemilianus, in the final and utter destruction of Rome's ancient enemy, Carthage. And of all Romans, according to legend, he was the first over the wall of that great city when it fell. And through the campaign, he learned much from his half-brother, modeling himself after the great general. He was hailed for his courage and loved by the men. Upon his return to Rome, he was elected quaestor, that second rank of the cursus honorum, the political circuit of Rome. As quaestor, he was sent to serve in the Numantian Wars, the fight to pacify Hispania. But he had the misfortune to serve under Gaius Mancinus, who led the legions to defeat after defeat. All the while, Tiberius, a man of sober disposition, maintained his respect for the general and for the authority of command. Then, in the dead of night, after yet another defeat, the nerve of Gaius Mancinus broke, and he tried to have the army withdraw and abandon their camp. But the Numantians heard them, and were upon them like the wind. They were in the camp. They smashed through the rear guard, and drove the once proud legion onto impossible terrain. Mancinus, utterly defeated, sent envoys to treat for terms of surrender, but the envoys were rebuffed. The Numantians said they would speak to no man but Tiberius. They had heard of him, and they respected him, but more than that, they remembered the deeds of his father. For his father, too, had fought in these lands, winning great victories for Rome, and then always making sure that Rome abided by the terms of its peace. So, while Gaius cowered, Tiberius met the Numantians. By the negotiations' end,